Hi there, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. Today, I want to talk a little bit about Barry Goldwater. And for those of you who aren't au fait with American politics of the 1960s, Barry Goldwater's significance in the development of the right of the Republican Party, of what would currently be called conservatism, political conservatism, in America is absolutely key. There is perhaps no one figure more important than Goldwater in a kind of revolt on the right that takes place in American political discourse in the mid 1960s. And the presidencies of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan have an awful lot. They owe an awful lot to Goldwater and the ideas that he initiated. Goldwater was the son of a well-to-do Arizona retail magnate who despised liberals, the welfare spending of the federal government, thought that there should be head-on confrontation with the Soviet Union, and any idea of compromise smacked of defeatism and betrayal. And it might be convenient, though I would argue quite lazy, to compare him with the current candidate attempting to get the Republican Party nomination. He, like Voldemort, who shall remain nameless. But an awful lot of what the current lead runner, let's call it Donald Trump, an awful lot of what Trump stands for at the moment, actually Goldwater disagreed with. And this is why simply casting Goldwater as this kind of reactionary on the right doesn't really tell the full story of this very complicated man. Now, the other thing I think that's interesting about Goldwater is that from time to time, marginal ideas become slowly adopted and assimilated into mainstream thinking. And how this happens is partly a question for historians, it's partly a question for sociologists, perhaps even for social psychologists. But an equivalent process you see happening in Great Britain from the mid-60s onwards, and perhaps even from the late 1950s, when Enoch Powell and Peter Thorneycroft stormed out of Macmillan's government, angry at the compromise with the trade unions, high welfare spending, a commitment to full employment, and their monetarist arguments, the arguments of Hayek. And if you haven't listened about Hayek, go way back, I think probably back to 2013, I'm sure I did a podcast on him then, Friedrich von Hayek, that they endorsed his ideas, but it took really until not even 1979, with the advent of Margaret Thatcher, because I would argue that Margaret Thatcher, when she came to power in 79, wasn't fully ready to introduce monetarist ideas. It took really midway through Thatcher's first term to really fully embrace monetarism, with immense economic crises that follow as a result. Anyway, the point being that these fringe ideas that in times of political and economic consensus, as you have in the 1960s in America, in Great Britain as well, these fringe ideas can seem crackpot 1 minute and then start to really be assimilated into mainstream thinking. Why? What does that? Well, it's normally economic crisis. Normally, you have periods of relative contentment, such as you do in the 1960s, when the American economy is booming. They can afford a powerful and assertive military overseas, a large commitment to welfare spending, as they do in things like Johnson's Great Society, and still a booming consumer economy. It's looked back as something of a golden age. However, when you find that these economic conditions cease to exist, and the countries very quickly wind up spending what appears to be beyond their means, living beyond their means, then the arguments of people like Goldwater seem to be more significant. So Goldwater was a US Senator and gained the Republican Party nomination to challenge Lyndon Johnson in 1964. Goldwater had been a good friend of John F. Kennedy, the recently assassinated Democrat president, though their politics were not really shared. Kennedy is not quite the liberal figure that we should think of him as. In reality, in terms of state spending on welfare, social reform, civil rights legislation, Lyndon Johnson wins hands down in the Battle of the Progressives in the mid-1960s. So it's quite plausible to see why Goldwater and Kennedy might well have hit it off. So when Goldwater ran against Johnson in 1964, he lost, and he lost with the biggest electoral defeat ever recorded in US history. The landslide towards Johnson was phenomenal, and this was obviously partly to do with the legacy of John F. Kennedy, but it was also to do with the fact that since the New Deal and since the war years, the political consensus in American life at a grassroots level, at an individual everyday level, and at a higher political level had moved to the centre-left. The idea that the state could intervene and should intervene to improve the condition of the people. The idea that leaving things exclusively to the vagaries of the free market was a catastrophic idea, that it had people still had long and bitter memories of the Great Depression, and had been grateful to Roosevelt and the New Deal. And so arguments that closely echoed Herbert Hoover's suggested talk of rugged individualism and self-reliance, and people being responsible for themselves and their own affairs and not relying on government. These things were seen as antiquated, backward, and had contributed to the crises of the 1930s. Herbert Hoover was a hero to Goldwater, but the majority of the population had little interest in what Goldwater was trying to say. Now, the fact that Goldwater is defeated in 1964 also meant that an awful lot of conservative, with a small c, Republicans are swept away as well. People that sound like Goldwater are removed from power. This, you might say, would be a catastrophe for the conservative movement within the Republican Party, but it actually wasn't. Some of the people who lost their seats in 1964 were kind of conservatives of a slightly older generation. They were conservatives of a slightly less vigorous and combative outlook. And when they are removed and forced into retirement and leave active politics, following the rout of 1964, their shoes are filled by a younger and more assertive generation who are anxious to prove that the wheels of the Johnson administration will come off at a certain point, and indeed they do towards the end of the 1960s. Johnson's belief was that the Great Society would be the biggest expansion in state intervention in the economy and state spending since the New Deal, and would even eclipse the New Deal. Johnson, whilst a huge admirer of Roosevelt, was hoping to, in fact, become an even more significant figure in the improver of living standards in the USA. And Johnson also believed that the Great Society was perhaps the only method by which the appalling conditions in which many black Americans had to live would be alleviated. So one of the problems that Goldwater encounters is that he's got the majority of the US press, which is a moderately centrist in its politics at this point, he has the majority of the press lobby against him. He was something of a kind of like a magnet for political gaffes, telling sort of off-color jokes about his daughter, having accidents, tripping over, and that sort of thing. The kind of thing that almost magically happens to politicians when the cameras are on them. For example, in an interview, he made something like almost like a GCSE level howler by suggesting that Kennedy had never sent troops into the South to enforce civil rights law. And he believed that the tenets of the New Deal, things like the Tennessee Valley Authority and Social Security, should be abolished or privatized, and that, if necessary, that field commanders in the American army should be able to employ nuclear weapons without presidential authority. And that was a clear reference to Truman's sacking of MacArthur during the Korean War. And this is the sort of the sort of kind of the madness that turns off huge swathes of undecided voters or moderates, and that's normally in a kind of most Western democratic societies. It's that chunk in the middle that you're trying to capture. There's no point in telling the middle voters your most extreme ideas, because it's only your diehards that really want to hear that. Now, Goldwater, his only opponent for the Republican nomination is Nelson Rockefeller, a liberal, a Republican figure, and part of the kind of the New England elite. And Goldwater considers himself to be an outsider. Now, this is an interesting kind of pedigree within the Republican movement of outsiders, those that claim not really to have been born with a silver spoon. Well, Goldwater was really. It just was perhaps not quite as silver as the Rockefellers and the real kind of old political aristocracy, or political and economic aristocracy of the USA. And you can see, Nixon had this kind of chip on his shoulder as well, as being this sort of outsider figure who never had the breaks. And Nixon really does come from nothing. He had a very poor childhood in California. And the version, the view of the world view that the likes of Goldwater and Nixon that they create is the sense of kind of being embattled underdogs, that they are people who are like their audience, like everyday Republican voters, tired of being patronised by well-heeled kind of champagne socialists, the people who tell them how to live and what to do and how the state will kind of administer that. And these are all wild exaggerations for the most part, but they feel, they tapped into a sense of anger that educated East and West Coast Ivy League types who have a kind of the do-gooder conscience about them were telling them how to live, and that this was really not what American-ness was all about. Quite the opposite, American-ness in the kind of conservative Republican way of looking at the world was about self-reliance, individualism, and having as little to do with government as is physically possible. Goldwater seemed to have this magnetic effect on younger conservatives and younger Republican activists. And these were the ones who'd been hoping for a Goldwater presidency, and these are the ones who had felt, thoroughly disappointed by Nixon's failure to be elected in 1960. And the epicenter of Goldwater and later Reagan's popularity was Orange County in California. And it's here that kind of everything that has happened since, between about 1968 and the birth of the Tea Party, really makes sense. Orange County had been the epitome of the American dream in the 30s and 40s, as refugees, really, from the Midwest, from the Dust Bowl, fled there and actually found that there were good jobs and prosperity. And after 1945, there was a kind of a sudden development of very attractive suburbia there, available to white families at a knockdown price with government loans. It's ironic, really, that they become so profoundly anti-statist later on, perhaps unaware of how much the state had developed their standard of living. So the Southern California suburbs had really embraced what Goldwater had to say. Now, perhaps if you have reached a level of economic development, personal economic development, where you're not so reliant on the state, then the state represents not help, but a threat in terms of taxation and general kind of interference in one's lifestyle. The spirit, the attitude, the prevailing ethos in places like Orange County was that of social advancement, entrepreneurship, and ambition, in ways that perhaps didn't manifest itself in other parts of America. And as a result, in these fairly small areas, these fairly small electoral areas, you get the beginnings of Goldwater's thinking really seeping down and really being embraced on a very, very deep level. Now, Goldwater's defeat in '64 isn't the end of his career by any stretch of the imagination. He goes on to serve Arizona as senator for the next 3 decades, and he is quite a prolific introducer of new legislation, particularly as it pertains to the United States Defense Department. He is credited really with popularizing the tenets of the United States Republican conservative movement. And these are really that the state should be little more than a night watchman. The other pivotal figure in all of this, whilst taking on a kind of a more broadly philosophical level, is of course the novelist Ayn Rand, about whom a separate podcast is necessary. But Ayn Rand and Goldwater, between them, really kind of laid waste to the idea for many Americans that the state was the answer. By the 1980s, Ronald Reagan seizes this concept and popularizes it, and he is, in his first term, he is explicit about this, saying that the problem that America has had is that there is too much government, that government cannot answer the people's problems. In fact, it should recede, and with it, taxes should go down. Now, the opponents of Goldwater and Reagan and Ayn Rand say, well, this is all fair and well, but you're essentially unpicking sort of social contracts, and you are unpicking the social ties that hold civil society together, that, rich people should not be allowed to keep all their taxes at the expense of the state that redistributes some of that wealth to poor people, and because otherwise the society will become incredibly polarised. And this is essentially what does happen during the 1980s in America, but it had been a process that had been ongoing since the 1970s as well. So the extent to which the polarisation is solely due to the tax laws introduced by Reagan in the 1980s is questionable, but they in themselves do have a very significant part to play. Part of Goldwater's appeal, and you can see this in some of his publicity material, is that he's from Arizona, he appears on his posters and flyers with a Winchester rifle and a Stetson, and he's really trying to evoke something from American sort of popular memory and the kind of the historical memory really of America's 19th century and of the Wild West. And the spirit of the frontiersman or the cowboy is something that is, a deep emotional and psychological part of kind of American mythology and the idea of rugged individualism and being able to live by one's own moral codes beyond the kind of the fetters of the state. And part of the appeal of the kind of the cowboy in popular imagination is that he exists really kind of beyond the control of the state in the sort of the anarchic world that we see in Wild West movies. Now, of course, this is all fantasy, really. This is all wishful thinking. This is all projection, and every society does it. Every society has its sort of folk heroes, which ultimately never really existed, or existed in significantly different format to that in the way it's presented. But Goldwater tries to kind of encapsulate all of that. And Goldwater also, as previously mentioned, taps into this kind of deep-seated anger and resentment that many working-class Americans have towards the highfalutin liberal type. And this resentment was enhanced throughout the Cold War, as America finds it harder and harder to find some sort of meaningful resolution to the Vietnam War. The voice of the kind of the liberal intellectual left, which hated by Richard Nixon, becomes more and more critical of the government and more critical of government policy. And Nixon's core support were, blue-collar, working-class men who thought that what was really needed was a kind of a more tough, masculine, macho, and no-nonsense approach to dealing with the Soviets and dealing with the North Vietnamese. And the counter-demonstrators very often against the student protesters who picketed Richard Nixon's public appearances were working-class construction workers and dock workers and that kind of thing. They were referred to by the New Left as the hard-hat fascists. And part of this is explained through class. That there was a feeling that liberals were actually wealthy and entitled, and because they had been given many of life's perks, they now had the opportunity and the scope to wax eloquent about the future of America and the running of America and how ordinary folk should live. So there is a great deal of resentment there. The one thing that Goldwater doesn't do, and this is a later development, this is Nixon, Goldwater doesn't tap into the religious right. Goldwater was half Jewish, but he considered himself an Episcopalian, but he was not a man who believed in compulsory church attendance. He said that one has one's own moral codes to live by, and if you live by those, you don't need to necessarily go to church. And he, in his later years, because he has a libertarian stance, he's all about small government and about people retaining the control over their own lives and making their own moral decisions. He becomes opposed to the actual anti-libertarian views of the religious right in terms of sexual politics and gender politics. One of his grandsons eventually came out as gay. And in very later life, in his 80s actually, Goldwater took a stance for gay rights, obviously kind of horrifying his electoral base. So when you're talking about Goldwater, if you're a student and you're writing an essay about this, it's important to say, yes, sure, he's on the economic right. He's on the side of free markets and free enterprise and low taxes and low regulation. But he's not on the side, really, of the Christian reactionary religious right. And he found that religious conservatism was a real challenge to his libertarian views. So that's a good distinction to get in there if you can. Okay, right, well, I'm going to finish there, but we are coming up to our 100,000th subscriber. I can't quite believe it myself, and we'll be doing, I think, probably in a fortnight when we get the big 6-figure. We'll be doing a special giveaway courtesy of our good friends at IB Tourists of the new biography of Lord Kitchener, Hero and Anti-Hero. So stay tuned for that. And also, I'll be bringing some updates to you about some, if you're teaching, about some online webinar work I'm doing later in the year. And final announcement, if you're able at all to support the crowdfunder, it just means that we can continue at Explaining History HQ to send you out a weekly podcast year in, year out. Funding the hosting does cost a little bit of money, so if you can spare a dime, I'd be very, very grateful, and I'll put the link underneath this this podcast in the pod hoster thingy, wherever you download it. Anyway, we'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. All the best. Bye-bye.